G'day, this is Chris Savage from Herald Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the life of the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. I pray that this will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Welcome to the second session in the life of Messiah. Now, last week, what we do, we were talking about that this study takes on a thematic approach. It's not a geographic approach to Jesus's life. It's a thematic approach, which means that we'll see the results of things that Jesus said and did. So when Jesus did a specific teaching, we will see the result of that teaching, and that's what we're going to do this study. Each gospel writer had his particular theme. Matthew, he writes to the Jews. He speaks about Jesus being the King of the Jews. And he explains and he proves that Jesus is the Messiah, he's Messianic King. Mark writes to the Romans. His theme is Jesus, the servant of Jehovah, takes that from Isaiah, and he presents Jesus as a man of action. Luke writes to the Greeks, and his theme is Jesus is the Son of Man. So he focuses on Jesus's humanity. So that's where Jesus gets tired and hungry in Luke's gospel, not in the other gospels. And also he, writing to the Greeks have two main areas of interest. The Greeks are interested in historical accuracy and also the concept of the ideal man, one who is disciplined both in mind and body. And that's Luke. He's writing to the Greeks in regard to that. Remember, Luke is the only gospel writer who says that he writes in chronological order. So Luke's gospel is the chronological sequence of Jesus's life. So Luke also has three special areas of interest that he writes about. He writes about Jerusalem, he writes about Gentiles, and he writes about women. In Luke's gospel, we find that it's the women who finance Jesus's ministry. John comes along after these three gospels are out and about in the wider church, and now he comes along and his theme is Jesus is the Son of God. He is God. It's written for the church at large. He has two sub-themes in his gospel, and that's the conflict between light and darkness, and also the fact that Jesus came to reveal the Father to men. Jesus is the revealer of the Father to men. In John's gospel, he also has, we'll find most of Jesus's discourses and teachings here. We find 7 discourses, 7 I am statements, 7 signs. John likes to work around the number 7. In John's prologue, which is the first 18 verses of John chapter 1, John sets out to prove the pre-existence of Jesus, but he existed from before he was born. So he's God. So he speaks about Jesus being the Logos, but we looked at that, and the Logos that he's actually speaking about is the Memra, the Aramaic term Memra, Hebrew term Devar. And the 7 things we learned about the Memra, which the rabbis also taught about the Memra, was that the Memra, the word, is distinct from God, yet he is the same as God. We also learned that he's the agent of creation. He's the agent of salvation. He was the means by which God takes on visible form, the Memra, which is Jesus. The Memra is also the means by which God signs his covenants, and the Memra is the agent of salvation. So all of this in the first 18 verses of John's gospel. We can summarize what John said in his prologue. Jesus, the word became visible. The world didn't recognize him. And sadly, the Jewish people didn't recognize him. But individual Jews and Gentiles who recognized him became children of God, and they received their salvation from the one who is the agent of salvation. Okay, tonight, let's get going. Here we go. We're looking at the genealogy of the king, and we find this in only 2 gospel writers. We find this in Luke and in Matthew. In Luke chapter 3, verse 23, it says, Jesus himself, when he began to teach, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, son of Heli. And in verse 38, He's the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. So only these two gospel writers give us the genealogical accounts of Jesus, Matthew and Luke. And that's because only these two gospels deal with the birth and early life of Jesus. Mark and John began their accounts with Jesus already an adult. So only Matthew and Luke deal with the birth and early life of Jesus as much as we know of him in their gospels. Yeah, Matthew gives the birth, early life from Joseph's perspective. Matthew, writing to Jews, writes about men. So you notice that in Matthew, Joseph plays the active role, Mary plays the passive role. In Matthew, we read of angels appearing to Joseph, but nothing about Mary. Matthew tells us what's happening in Joseph's mind, but nothing in Mary's mind. Where Luke now, remember Luke writes special interest about women. So Luke tells the very same story, but it comes from Mary's perspective. It's all reversed. Mary plays the active role and Joseph the passive role. We read of an angel appearing to Mary, but not to Joseph. Luke tells us what Mary is thinking, but not a word about what Joseph is thinking. So even if that is all you have to go on, you can tell that the genealogy in Matthew is from Joseph's perspective and the story in Luke is from Mary's perspective. Question though is, why do we have two genealogies? We have the genealogy in Matthew, which is Joseph's, and the one in Luke, Miriam's or Mary's. But why actually do we include Joseph's genealogy? Because we know that Jesus was his adopted son, not his biological son. So why does Matthew have to record Joseph's line of descent at all? It doesn't come from Joseph. So why two genealogies? The more popular or the usual answer, which most commentaries you look at will tell you this, they say Matthew gives you the royal line and Luke gives us the real or biological line. So what this means is it's something like this. When you come to Matthew, Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus, was the heir apparent to the throne of David. And since Jesus was his adopted son, he can therefore claim the right to David's throne by virtue of the adoption by the heir apparent. Remember, you had to be a descendant of King David to sit on the throne. Now, while Luke, the usual narrative goes, gives us his real line through his mother Mary, showing us that through his mother, he was a descendant of David. So he receives his Davidic descent through his mother and his right to rule through his stepfather. And that's why we have two genealogies. So this is the usual answer. But we're going to show you tonight that this is actually the actual opposite to this is a true case. The point of Matthew's genealogy is that if he was the son of Joseph, he could not be king. So Jesus could not inherit the throne through Joseph. Now, as I said, Matthew and Luke are the only two gospels that present the birth of Jesus, but they do it from two different perspectives. And to understand why we have two genealogies, we have to go back to the Old Testament, where you have two requirements for kingship developing. The two requirements in the Old Testament for acceding to the throne in Israel, first of all, one was applied to the southern kingdom of Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem, while the other was applied to the northern kingdom of Israel with its capital in Samaria. Now, this happened after the split, after the death of Solomon. First requirement, which was only applied in the southern kingdom of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem, was the requirement of Davidic descent. Unless you were a descendant of King David, you had no right to sit on the throne of David. A son by adoption could not sit on the throne. In Isaiah chapters 7 and 8, If you go back down there, you'll see there was a conspiracy to overthrow the Davidic throne and replace it with someone else from a different dynasty, not from the Davidic dynasty. In chapter 8, Isaiah warns that God says it's doomed to failure. God will not allow anyone else outside the line of David to sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem. Why? Because God made a covenant with David. It would violate God's Davidic covenant. And we see the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7, verses 8 to 16, and 1 Chronicles 17, verse 7 to 15. So that's the first requirement for the southern kingdom of Judah. Second requirement, which was also applied to the northern kingdom of Israel with the 10 tribes with their capital in Samaria, was the requirement for kingship had to be by divine appointment or prophetic sanction. So unless you received a divine appointment or a prophetic approval, one of God's prophets approved of you as a king, you have no right to sit on the throne in Samaria. Anyone who tried was assassinated. And in 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 30, God told a man called Jehu through a prophet that he would be the next king of Samaria and that his line would run for 4 generations. When the 5th generation tried to gain the throne, he was assassinated. Now, both of these requirements play a role in the genealogy of Jesus. And so we have to explain why we need these 2 genealogies. An additional limitation from the prophet Jeremiah to the first requirement, which is one had to be from the house of David. But there's a requirement. There was one stipulation. He had to be apart from King Jeconiah, who was a descendant of David. So it means he could not be from the lineage of King Jeconiah. Now, in Matthew's account, in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17, when we look at his account, we see that he breaks with Jewish tradition and law on 2 accounts. In Matthew 1:1, it says, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then if you go to verse 17, it says, so all the generations from Abraham and onto David are 14 generations, and from David onto the carrying away to Babylon, 14 generations. From the carrying away to Babylon onto the Christ, 14 generations. What we see with Matthew's genealogy is that he skips names. Some names are omitted, such as 3 of the kings of Judah. We didn't read them all. I'm just telling you. 3 of them are missing. Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah. And these guys are actually included in the line of descendants in 1 Chronicles 3:11 to 12. But Matthew doesn't mention them. So that's the first thing where he breaks with Jewish tradition. He skips names. Second thing, what he does here, he also mentions the names of women, which again goes contrary to Jewish practice. And the 4 women that he mentions, they're all Gentiles. We have Tamar in verse 3, chapter 1, verse 3. We have Rahab, verse 5. We have Ruth in verse 5. And we see in verse 6, it says her. That her refers to Bathsheba. Now, imagine, of all the women that he could have mentioned in the Messianic line, the ones he mentions are not prominent except for Ruth. What about Sarah or Rebecca? You know, these are the matriarchs of the Jewish women. They're very prominent, but they're not mentioned. But Matthew has a reason for mentioning these 4, for they all have 2 things in common. First of all, these 4 women are all Gentiles. Matthew is early on putting down the groundwork that he will develop later on, that even though the primary purpose of the Messiah was to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the Gentiles will also benefit from his coming. That's the first thing. The second thing regarding these women, the common element among these four women is that 3 of the 4 are guilty of specific sexual sins. We see in Genesis 38, verses 1 to 30, where Tamar was guilty of incest. In Joshua chapter 2, verse 1 to 11, Rahab was guilty of prostitution. In 2 Samuel 11, 1 to 11, Bathsheba was guilty of adultery. The fourth one, Ruth, she's a Moabitess, which means that she's from the tribe of Moab. How did Moab come about? Moab came about from an ancestral relationship with Lot and his daughters. And we see that in Genesis chapter 19, verse 23 to 38. So why did Matthew put these women in there, especially these women with these sexual issues? Here Matthew makes a point that he's going to develop later on in that the purpose of Messiah's coming was to save sinners. So in these 2 ways, that is skipping names and mentioning women, he breaks with normal Jewish laws and practices concerning genealogies. However, women, Gentiles, and sinners are not the key points of Matthew's genealogy. The theme of his gospel, remember, was Jesus the Messiah, the King of the Jews. Because Matthew is writing to the Jewish reader, in his genealogy, he has only to go back to Abraham. Why? Because Abraham's the father of the Jews. And he starts from Abraham. So in Matthew 1, verse 2, his genealogy starts with Abraham and then moves forward to his day. So from verses 2 to 6, he moves from Abraham to David. There's the first 14 generations. Then in verse 7, he picks up with one of David's sons, King Solomon, and moves to verse 11, where we read, and Josiah begat Jeconiah and his brethren at the time of the carrying away to Babylon. Another 14 generations. Remember that name, Jeconiah. We'll come back to him shortly. Then in Matthew, in verse 12, he's starting with Jeconiah in verse 12 to verse 16. You come to Joseph, the husband of Mary and the stepfather of Jesus. And it says in verse 16. So all the generations from Abraham on to David are 14 generations, and from David onto the carrying away to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the carrying away to Babylon onto the Christ, 14 generations. You'll notice that Matthew has skipped names to arrive at 3 sequences of 14 generations. First, between Abraham to David. Second, from David to Coniah or Jeconiah, and that's the carrying away to Babylon, because that's when Jeconiah was carried away to Babylon. And then from Jeconiah or Coniah to Joseph. But why is he 14 generations? Well, because that's the numerical value for the name of David. And according to Matthew, Joseph was a direct descendant of David through Solomon, his son, but also through Jeconiah. And this one fact means that Joseph could not have been the heir apparent to David's throne. So, contrary to popular thinking or the normal explanations out there, Jesus is not the heir apparent to David's throne through Joseph. Why? Because of this one man called Jeconiah in verse 11. If we go to Jeremiah chapter 22, I'll put a few of the verses here for us on this slide. In Jeremiah chapter 22, Jeremiah spells out judgment on the last of the kings of Judah, and in particular, Jeconiah. I'm going to read from verse 24 to verse 30 for you on the screen. There's from 28 to 30. As I live, saith, this is chapter 22, verse 24, Jeremiah. As I live, saith Jehovah, though Coniah is a shortened form for Jeconiah, though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were the signet upon my right hand, yet would I pluck thee thence, and I'll give thee into the hand of them that seek thy life, and into the hand of them of whom thou art afraid, even into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of the Chaldeans. And I will cast thee out and thy mother that bare thee into another country where you were not born, and there shall you die. But to the land whereunto their soul longeth to return, thither shall they not return. Verse 28, is this the man Coniah, a despised broken vessel? Is he a vessel wherein none delighteth? Wherefore are they cast out? He and his seed, and all cast into the land which they know not. Now listen, O earth, 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 hear the word of Jehovah. Thus says Jehovah, write ye this man childless, a man that shall not prosper in his days, for no more shall a man of his seed prosper, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling in Judah. Now, this was the curse upon Jeconiah or Coniah. Because of the kind of man that he was, God pronounces a curse on him, and this curse grows in intensity as you go through it. It starts out mild and then it goes from worse to worse. We have two primary curses in Jeremiah 22, verse 25 to 30. Jeconiah, first one, Jeconiah will be taken into Babylonian captivity, and he is going to die in captivity. That's verse 25. He will never see his land again, never be back to Israel again. Secondly, when the high point of this passage is reached in verse 29, Jehovah calls on the earth 3 times to hear the high point of the curse in verse 30. And that high point of the curse is that none of his sons or descendants will ever again sit on the throne of David. Now remember, as we said earlier, the first requirement of God for kingship in Judah was Davidic descent. But now the requirement is further narrowed in that it must be of Davidic descent apart from Jeconiah. Cannot be from Jeconiah's line. So the curse says no one will again sit on the throne of David who belongs to the line of Jeconiah. Now we've just learned by looking at Matthew's account that while Joseph, he was a descendant of David, tick 1, yes, he was through Solomon, yep. So he was also a descendant through Jeconiah. And in light of the Jeconiah curse found in Jeremiah, Joseph was not the heir apparent to David's throne. So why are there 2 genealogies? Matthew could not have included Joseph's genealogy in his gospel to show that Jesus claims his legal right to the throne of David as Joseph's adopted son. He had a different purpose in mind. For if Jesus was the real son of Joseph, it would disqualify him from sitting on David's throne. Neither can Jesus, even by adoption, claim David's throne because Joseph was not the heir apparent because he came from the line of Jeconiah. So this raises another question then, and that is, well, how did Matthew indicate that Jesus was descended only from Mary and was not Joseph's biological son? He told us that in verse 16 of Matthew 1, Joseph was the husband of Miriam, of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Messiah. In the Greek, the pronoun whom, the husband of whom was born, husband of Miriam, of whom, that word whom, it's feminine. So what that means in Greek is putting the emphasis on the mother alone, of whom this Jesus was born of Mary alone. Joseph was the husband of Mary. He was Jesus's legal father, but he was not his biological father. The child was hers alone. So Matthew, unlike Luke, he gives us Joseph's line through Zechariah and his curse, and then solves the problem by Matthew chapter 2, the virgin birth. So in other words, Jesus, through Joseph's legal right or otherwise, cannot assume the throne. If he did, it would prove that he is not the Messiah of God. So the dilemma is solved by the virgin birth of Jesus, completely bypassing the Zechariah curse. So although Jesus was the legal son of Joseph, he was not the real son of Joseph. There is no blood or biological connection at all between the two. And as we will see, Luke does not have that problem. He begins in reverse order. The virgin birth of Jesus first, and then in chapter 3 with the genealogy. So if we go to Luke chapter 3, verse 23 to 38, in contrast to Matthew, Luke follows a strict Jewish procedure and Jewish law in that he skips no names and he does not mention the names of any women. Now, if by Jewish law you can't mention a woman's name in a genealogy, that now raises two very interesting questions that we need to answer here. First question is, if you can't put a woman's name, a woman's line, and you can't use her name, what do you do? The answer here is that under Jewish law, you would use the name of her husband as a replacement. Now we have a second question. You use the husband's name. Suppose someone like Luke, who was doing his research to write his gospel, he picked up a genealogical tablet or a scroll. How could he tell by reading it whether the genealogy is that of the husband or of the wife? Because both genealogies will have the husband's name, and in this case, it would have Joseph's name. The answer is not that difficult. But the problem is in English grammar. That's where the problem is. It's considered bad English to use a definite article, the, before a proper name. So you would not go around saying, the Lisa or the David or the Margaret. This is not considered proper English. However, in the original Greek, it was permissible to speak of the Mary or the Joseph, definite article the. In the Greek text of Matthew and Luke, before every name, you have the definite article the, with one exception in Luke chapter 3, verse 23. And Jesus himself, when he began to teach, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph. Joseph's name does not have a definite article in front of it in the Greek. Someone reading the original language could tell by the missing definite article that this is not really Joseph's line, it's the line of his wife Mary. And this is the wife's genealogy, not the husband's. And you can find two examples of this in the Old Testament. Ezra chapter 2, verse 61, and Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 63. They're two examples where the husband's name is used, but it's actually the wife's genealogy. So what we're dealing with in Luke is the genealogy of Joseph's wife, Mary. The other difference here is that Luke went from Mary back to Adam, whereas Matthew went from Abraham to Joseph. Luke's genealogy goes back to Adam. Why? Because remember, Luke is writing about Jesus, the Son of Man. Who was the first man? Adam. So he takes the genealogy right back to the first man where human history started, and Matthew only goes back to Abraham to show Jesus is a Jew. Abraham, the father of the Jews. Both of these writers, though, bring out in the genealogy that Mary and Joseph were of the house and lineage of David, King David. Verses 23 and 24 picks up the genealogy, but notice Mary's genealogy to David goes back to Nathan, not Solomon, in verse 31. Nathan is another son of David through Bathsheba. So not through Solomon. He's the son of Nathan is the son of David and Bathsheba. That means that Mary was the daughter of David. But unlike Joseph, who was from the line of Solomon, her line was through Nathan, her immediate father being Heli, apart from Jeconiah. So while there is no biological connection between Joseph and Jesus, Mary was his mother, and the biological connection was real, and it's apart from the curse of Jeconiah. Since Jesus was the real son of Mary, he too was a descendant of David apart from Jeconiah. So this means that he fulfilled the first Old Testament requirement for becoming king over Judah. He was a member of the house of David apart from Jeconiah. Now, at this point in Jewish history, there were many descendants of David apart from Jeconiah. So why should Jesus be the one to claim the throne of David and not one of the others? That's where we have the second requirement coming in. But we'll come up to that a bit later in Luke chapter 1, 26 to 38. We'll do that next week. Now, Messiah, Jesus, the Christ, has many different names and titles and many descriptive terms, and 4 of these are within these 2 genealogies. 2 in Matthew, 2 in Luke. And each name says something about his person and his work. In Matthew 1:1, it says he's the son of David. He's a king. Matthew 1:1, he's the son of Abraham. He's a Jew. In Luke 3:38, he's the son of God. He's divine. In Luke 3:38, he's the son of Adam. He's human. So these 4 titles, in Matthew 1:1, he's king, he's a Jew. In Luke 3:38, he's divine, he's human. These 4 titles portray the messianic person as the Jewish God, man, king. And in the paragraphs we're going to be looking at, the writers are going to connect the coming Messiah with one or more of the 4 eternal Jewish covenants of the Old Testament that God made with Israel. In Matthew 1:1, Jesus is connected with 2 of these 4 eternal covenants that God made. First one, by calling him the son of David, it now connects Jesus, the Messiah, with the Davidic covenant. By calling him the son of Abraham, it connects Jesus with the Abrahamic covenant. The other 2 covenants are the land and the new covenants. Paul also taught Jesus as Messiah, the son of David. And as the Jewish leaders did not dispute Jesus' Davidic descent, this caused Roman authorities to be alarmed. And after all this, this was a new messianic movement with a leader who could have claimed the throne of David. So that's why the Romans got a bit toey. Okay. We're looking at paragraph 4, which would be in the Harmony of the Gospels, and it's Luke chapter 1, verse 5 to 25. And this is the Annunciation of John's birth to Zechariah. To annunciate is simply to inform that some future event will happen, and in this case, it's by angelic announcement. We also know, if you get through the scriptures, you will find that many biblical names found in scripture often have meanings related to a message. Your notes will have these PowerPoints back to front. I had to change it. In Luke chapter 1, 5 to 25, we're introduced to 2 people. We're introduced to Zechariah, or Zacharias, and Elisheva, or Elizabeth. Zechariah, or Zacharias in Hebrew, means God remembers, or Jehovah remembers. Elisheva, or Elizabeth, means the oath of God. Husband and wife put the names together. It says God remembers his oath, or God remembers his covenantal promises. And later we're going to see a play in these words with the meanings of these names. Johanan, who is John, John's name, who's going to be the son of Zechariah and Elizabeth, means the grace of Jehovah, or Jehovah is gracious. And by giving him this name, God was now announcing a new age or a new dispensation. Okay, in Luke 1, 5-25, after the introduction of his gospel, in which he explained the purpose for which he wrote and how he gathered in his information, Luke now provided some details regarding the political and religious rulers of his time. In verse 5 of Luke 1, he says, "There was in the days of Herod, king of Judea, a certain priest named Zechariah of the course of Abijah." Now, back in 1 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 1-19, King David divided the tribe of Levi into 24 courses. There was one high priest, and below him we had 24 chief priests, and under them were the common priests, and they formed the 24 courses. And this is called the Mishmarat, or the watches. So we have a chief priest headed up over each course. Now, Zechariah, he was a common priest, excuse me, in one of the 24 courses, and verse 5 tells us he was of the course of Abijah. Now, just as they did during the time of David, the priests functioned as officials and judges, and also as assistants, as worship leaders, and doorkeepers and guards. So each of the 24 courses served in rotation, a roster system. And they would perform the regular daily functions and rituals at the temple for 1 week, twice a year. And by the first century in Jesus' day, the estimated number of priests was 18,000. So as the course of Abijah came up, and by the casting of lots, different men, different common priests would be chosen to do different functions. And in this instance, the burning of the incense in the holy place fell to Zechariah, or Zacharias. It was totally possible that you could be a priest and only get the opportunity to serve in the temple compound once in your lifetime. Now, verse 6 tells us that Zacharias and Elizabeth were of the believing remnant of that day. Verse 6 says, "They were both righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and requirements of the Lord." It says blameless. This does not mean sinless, but what it does mean is that when they did sin, they offered the required sacrifices and were obedient to the commands and ordinances, having their sins expiated. And so they were therefore rendered blameless. Inwardly, they were saved and regenerate people, and they showed it by walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord. Now, the job that Zacharias was to have in the temple was a fairly simple, straightforward job. He had to burn incense on the altar of incense, and he would do this twice a day, every morning, every evening. The procedure was to take hot coals from the brazen altar, or the altar of sacrifice, which was outside the temple building, and he would take the hot coals into the holy place to the altar of incense, which is in front of the veil that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And he would then put the hot coals on the altar of incense, and then what he would do is he would drop incense on the hot coals, and as it burned, a sweet smell would arise, and the aroma would go through the thick veil as a sweet smelling offering before the Lord in the Holy of Holies. And this special incense was to be burned perpetually before the Lord upon this golden altar of incense. And we see that back from Exodus 30, verse 8. So it was called the perpetual offering, perpetual offering. So these offerings were made at sunrise and at dusk. Now, the background to what's happening here, back in Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1-3, Leviticus 10, verses 1-3, we have two interesting characters here. And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took each of them in his censer and put fire therein and laid incense thereon and offered strange fire before Jehovah, which he had not commanded them. And there came forth fire from before Jehovah and devoured them, and they died before Jehovah. Then Moses said unto Aaron, This is it that Jehovah spake, saying, I will be sanctified in them that come nigh me, and before all the people I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. Nadab and Abihu, the two sons of Aaron, improperly burned the special incense before the Lord, and both were smitten dead. Now, this incident led the rabbis in Zechariah's day to teach that if any priest burned the incense improperly, he would also be struck dead. However, before death, this is what they taught, before death came, the angel of death would appear standing on the right side of the altar of incense. So the honor of being the priest who would enter the holy place and present to God the symbol of intercession on the altar of incense was already a great honor for Zechariah. That God would now speak to him through an angel is most certainly the climax of his career. Now, Luke 1 verse 10 says that while Zechariah burned the incense, the whole multitude of the people were praying without at the hour of incense. So while he's performing the ritual, and there appeared unto him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. So Zechariah suddenly saw an angel standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. Why was he troubled? Well, not just it was an angel, but this angel was standing on the right side of the altar. And just as he has been taught, he said, if you burn the incense wrong, an angel will appear and he'll stand on the right side of the altar. That's what he's seen now. So he's expecting to die. However, the message of the angel was not one of judgment and death, but actually it was that of blessing and new life to come. And in verses 13 to 25 of Luke chapter 1, we have the angel's message to Zechariah. Zechariah and Elizabeth had remained childless and had grown elderly. We see that in chapter 1, verse 7, which in rabbinic tradition meant that they were now over 60 years old. So instead of the dreaded judgment, the angel Gabriel, who we see, that's his name from verse 19, said unto Zechariah, Fear not, Zechariah, because thy supplication is heard, and thy wife Elizabeth shall bear thee a son, and thou shalt call his name John or Johanan. So the angel Gabriel announced that Zechariah's wife would conceive and bear him a son, and he was to call him Johanan. And we said in Hebrew, the root of this name is grace. And so Johanan means Jehovah is gracious. So with this naming of this son to be born, God was announcing the coming of a new age. Gabriel then proclaimed 6 things about his son that Zechariah would produce. Zechariah and Elizabeth would have joy and gladness, and many would rejoice at his birth. As verse 14. Look at the descriptions that the angel gives to Zechariah about this son who will be born. Verse 15, he'll be great in the sight of the Lord. Verse 15, not to drink wine or strong drink. Verse 16, filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. Verse 16, many will he turn to the Lord. Verse 17, he would go forth in the spirit and power of Elijah. He would turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, the disobedient to walk in the wisdom of the just. Verse 17, he was going to make ready a people prepared to receive the Messiah. We're going to look a little bit closer at these 6 descriptions of the angel to Zechariah. First, look at his name and then the description. His name, Johanan, John, grace. John will be the forerunner of the Messiah, forerunner of Jesus. And you can look back into Malachi 3 and see it there as well. By giving him this name, which actually caused a stir, God was now announcing a new dispensation, the age of grace, which will come through Jesus Christ. Now, first point, he was to be great in the sight of God. This is John the Baptizer's position before the Lord, a state of greatness. In fact, Jesus in Matthew 11:11 says about John, "Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist." So he shall be great in the sight of the Lord. Secondly, he was to drink no wine or strong drink. Why? Because he was going to be a Nazarite from birth, according to the stipulations in Numbers chapter 6, verses 2 to 8. Nazarites were to separate themselves unto Jehovah, no wine or strong drink. In fact, they're not even to partake of anything of the grape, not even the seed, not even the skin, nothing at all. Grapes, raisins, vine kernels, or liquid, wine, whether it's wine juice or vinegar, none of it. Can't have any of it. No razor was to come upon his head. Therefore, their hair was to be allowed to grow until the specific time of their vow had been fulfilled. And also, the person who made the vow could not come near a corpse, because this would render him ceremonially unclean. Now, anyone, man or woman, could take a Nazarite vow for a specific period of time. And the vow is normally taken voluntarily, length of the time optional. While normally voluntarily, we now have 3 men in history who were Nazarites from birth. We have Samson in Judges 13, verses 4 to 6. He was unfaithful in his vow. Then we had Samuel in 1 Samuel 1:11, who was faithful in his vow. And now we have John, who is the third and last person in Scripture to be a Nazarite from birth. Whether he was a Nazarite all his life, we don't know, because the Scriptures don't tell us that. It's not clear. Third thing about John, he'll be filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. Now, to be filled means to be controlled. So from Elizabeth's womb through John's life, the Holy Spirit will control him. And we're going to see an example of this later on. Fourthly, his basic task is to begin a repentance movement, a back to God movement, to turn the children of Israel back to their God. So this movement of John is to have a group of people ready and prepared to accept the Messiah when he comes, by telling them to repent and turn back to God. So he's preparing a people for Messiah. Fifth thing, it says he will go before his face in the spirit and power of Elijah. Notice it did not say he is Elijah. It just says that in the spirit and power of Elijah. And like Elijah, he will have a special ministry to the remnant. And later on, we will look at the Elijah and John issue. But for now, he comes in the spirit and the power of Elijah. And lastly, verse 17, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared for him. Remember, his job description is to have a people prepared to accept Jesus as Messiah when he comes and is identified as such. So when John baptized a person, that person was making a public commitment that when John pointed out the Messiah, he will believe on him. And we will see that when John points out the Messiah, that they do believe. And those who do not believe and do not submit to John's baptism will not believe in Messiah either. And that's the Jewish leadership of the day. So John's special calling, John's special calling is to be the Messiah's forerunner and herald of the King. Now, what's Zechariah's response to the angel's announcement? Up to now, Zechariah is listening, and in verse 18, he speaks, and he now asks the question in unbelief. How shall I know this for certain? For I'm an old man, and my wife is advanced in years. This question arises from unbelief. How can I know this is really true? So in his doubt and unbelief, the angel's response is, firstly, he identifies himself as Gabriel from before the presence of God. And if you look back into Daniel 8:16 and Daniel 9:21, that's Gabriel. And then, because of his unbelief, Zacharias will speak no more until the child is born. So Zacharias is smitten dumb. He's deaf and he's mute. He'll not be able to say anything until the promise is fulfilled. The job of burning incense, mind you, is not a hard job. It's not time consuming. But now the people and the priest, they marveled in verse 21. Why? Because he's in there for so long. But having a discussion with an angel probably takes a little bit longer than normal. Maybe he was smitten dead inside. But in verse 22, when Zechariah finally comes out, the people know that Zacharias had a supernatural experience, but he could not tell them what it was because he was smitten dumb mute. In verses 24 to 25, and after these days, Elizabeth, his wife, conceived, and she hid herself 5 months, saying, Thus hath the Lord done unto me in the days wherein he looked upon me to take away my reproach among men. So in keeping with Gabriel's message, Elizabeth conceives and she hides for 5 months, saying, God has taken away my reproach from among men. The reproach here refers to a very common attitude of that day, and it's often seen in biblical history. Women who were unable to conceive and produce children were despised. They were reproached for endangering the continuity of the husband's line. For Elizabeth, that reproach had now been removed. And that is it for tonight.